The copper ladle was the only thing Edith Morrow had brought from her father's house, and she had not intended to use it tonight. She had intended to survive tonight, which was a different thing entirely. The stew had been on since 2 o'clock. Edith had checked it 4 times. She had added the salt from the new cask at 3, the cask that had arrived that morning from Mr. Pike's most recent supplier, a man in Bristol whose references she had not been consulted about, and whose name she could not now remember. The kitchen at Ashbourne Park was hot and copper-hung, and smelled of bay leaves and rendered fat, and the particular sweetness of a fire that has been burning since dawn. Nance was at the bread table. The footmen waited at the door to the service passage with their silver-covered dishes and their stiff collars and their expressions of professional patience. Above them, in the dining room that overlooked the south lawn, the Viscount Halloway sat at the head of a table laid for 14, and his daughter Clara sat at his right hand because Dorothea Cavendish had permitted it, just this once, and Miss Felicity Garnett sat across from Clara with the faint expression of a woman who had expected to be seated closer to the head. Edith Morrow lifted the ladle and tasted the stew. She did not register the wrongness immediately. The first note was correct. The beef, the softened onion, the thyme from her own kitchen garden. Then came the salt, heavier than she had intended, and beneath the salt something else. Something that did not belong to any ingredient she had used. A bitterness at the back of the throat, faint and metallic, the way old water from a corroded pipe tastes when you are too tired to notice until you have already swallowed. She set the ladle down. She lifted it again and tasted once more, because she was thorough, and because she did not trust a single impression when 14 people's dinner hung upon her certainty. The bitterness was there. It was real. It was not from the beef, and not from the bay, and not from anything she had put into that pot. Edith said, "Nance." Her voice was quiet. The kitchen did not stop. She said it again, and something in the second syllable brought Nance's head up. "The serving dishes go back," Edith said. "Do not send the stew up. Nothing from this pot goes above stairs." There was a silence in the kitchen that was loud for its brevity. The head footman, whose name was Gideon, and who had been at Ashbourne Park for 11 years, said, "The family is waiting, Miss Morrow." "The family will wait a few minutes more," Edith said. She did not raise her voice. She moved the pot from the direct heat to the cooler edge of the range with both hands and straightened. "Tell them there is a delay. Tell them I apologize." Gideon looked at her with the particular expression that men of his position reserve for women of hers, when those women have done something inconvenient. He left without arguing, because something in Edith's face had stopped him, and Edith had counted on that. She leaned against the kitchen wall, then, and allowed herself one moment of absolute stillness, her hands flat against the cold stone, her breath measured and careful. The bitterness was spreading now, very faintly, into the base of her jaw. Not enough to fall. Not enough to make a sound about. She was 24 years old, and she had lived through harder things than this, and she would not fall in her own kitchen over a mouthful of stew. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the copper ladle where it rested on the block beside the pot. If she had not tasted it, Gideon would have carried it upstairs. The footman would have served it. Clara Cavendish would have eaten it, because Clara was 7 years old and had a 7-year-old's appetite, and she had been looking forward to the dinner all week. Edith stood away from the wall. She told Nance to start a fresh pot with the stock that had been held back. She sent word to Mr. Pike that she required him in the kitchen at his earliest convenience. She instructed Gideon, when he returned, that the family would have bread and potted meats and preserved apricots and an apple charlotte that was already done and cooling, and that the dinner would be rearranged to 30 minutes behind the hour. And then she sat down on the stool beside the cold hearth, because her legs had asked her to, and she held the copper ladle in both hands and waited to feel better. She was still sitting there, pale and very still, when the door at the top of the service stairs opened, and Richard Cavendish, Viscount Halloway, came below. He was not accustomed to coming below stairs. His hesitation at the foot of the last step was brief and quickly suppressed, but Edith saw it. She had spent 6 months learning what Richard Cavendish suppressed quickly, because the things he suppressed were often the truest things about him. He was 36 and had the look of a man who had been handsome once and had decided the observation was irrelevant. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that suggested the rest of him was not going to move until he was ready to move. He wore his evening dress as though it had been stitched onto him by someone who did not expect him to enjoy the experience. He looked at Edith. He looked at the pot pushed to the edge of the range. He looked at the copper ladle in her hands, and the color that was not in her face. "What has happened?" he said. It was not a question. "There is something wrong with the salt," Edith said. "I tasted the stew, and there is something wrong with it. I do not know yet precisely what." He crossed the kitchen in 5 strides, which was not many strides for a man of his height. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. "You tasted it. It is what a cook does before a dish goes to the table. You tasted something you believed to be contaminated." "I tasted it before I believed it to be contaminated," Edith said. "That is the order of events. I tasted it, and then I believed it." There was a long silence. Halloway looked at her in a way that no one at Ashbourne Park had looked at her before, which was to say that he looked at her as though she were a specific person rather than an efficient function of the household. It lasted exactly long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then he turned to the pot and called for Gideon, and issued a series of quiet instructions that reorganized the entire evening without raising his voice once. He was, Edith had concluded in her first week at Ashbourne Park, a man who was accustomed to very large things being handled with very few words. What she had not understood until this moment was that he was also a man who noticed things. She had assumed his distance was incuriosity. She was beginning to think it was something else. "I will send for the physician," he said, at the door to the service passage. "I'm quite well," Edith said. "I did not ask," he said. He looked at her once more. Then he went back upstairs. Edith set the copper ladle down on the block. She pressed both hands flat to the wooden surface and stood there for a moment, steadier than she had been, and thought about the fact that the Viscount Halloway had spoken to her directly for the first time in 6 months. She thought about his face, which had been a complicated thing to look at. And then she thought about Clara, who was 7, and who had been looking forward to the dinner. And she was glad, in the particular way she was glad about things now, quietly, and without expecting anyone to know it. She began the apple charlotte plates herself, because her hands were steadier when they were occupied, and because the family still needed their dinner, and the apple charlotte was done, and she was the cook. This is what it meant to be the cook. Edith Morrow had not always been the cook. She had been until 17 months before the dinner at Ashbourne Park, the third and youngest daughter of the Reverend George Morrow of Hutton Mallow in Somerset. She had kept house for him since her mother's death, when Edith was 15. She had cooked because she loved it, which was not the same thing as cooking because she had to. And the distinction had mattered a great deal in the Hutton Mallow years. She had read the Reverend's books because he permitted it. She had spoken Latin to him at breakfast when his spirits were low. She had known, in the abstract way of clergymen's daughters, that she might one day need to find a position because there was very little money and 2 older sisters who had married before any of the little money ran out. She had not fully understood what finding a position would mean until her father died in February 2 years ago, and the solicitor came and explained the debts. The debts were real and specific, as debts tend to be when they are finally counted, and they amounted to everything the Reverend had appeared to possess, and a modest quantity of things he had not. Her sisters offered her their spare rooms. Edith thanked them. She visited her sister Margaret in Bath for 3 weeks. And she understood, at the end of those 3 weeks, that she could not live in a spare room. She was not constituted for a spare room. She was constituted for a kitchen. She had placed a notice in the Bath Chronicle advertising her services as a cook. She had received 4 replies. She had accepted the one from Ashbourne Park in Wiltshire, because the terms were clear, the distance from Bath was sufficient, and the position came with a kitchen of her own to manage. She had not known, when she arrived, that the household was not quite what it had been. She had not known about the late Viscountess, who had died 3 years before of a fever that swept the estate. She had not known about the particular kind of grief that looks, from the outside, exactly like cold authority. She had not known about Clara. Clara she had known about by the end of her first week. The child had come below stairs in the first days of October, on a Tuesday morning when the light was thin and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon from the pickling Edith was doing. She had come in small and serious, in a dark wool dress and with her father's set to her jaw, and she had said, without preamble, "Are you the new cook?" "I am," Edith said. "Mrs. Hopwell before you made the pastry too thick," Clara said. "It was not terrible, but it was thick." "I prefer a thin pastry," Edith said. "More butter." Clara had considered this. She had looked at the kitchen, at the copper hung on the walls, at the bunch of dried lavender Edith had put up above the window, at the copper ladle that rested on the block, because Edith brought it out every morning and returned it there because it was hers, and the rest of the kitchen was not. The child's gaze had rested on it for a moment, with the particular attention of children who understand objects. "What is that?" Clara had said. "My ladle," Edith had said. "I brought it from my father's house." "Is your father the cook at another house?" "My father was a clergyman," Edith said. "He is dead." "So is my mother," Clara said. They had looked at each other across the block, Edith and Clara Cavendish. Then Clara had climbed onto the stool without being invited and watched Edith work for 2 hours without speaking again. And this arrangement suited them both so well that it had become, without either of them naming it, a habit. Edith had not met the Viscount Halloway until he came to the kitchen after the incident with the stew. This was not unusual. He ran the estate, attended to correspondence, rode out in the mornings, and appeared at table for dinner and breakfast. The household ran between those appearances, managed in the upper portion by Dorothea Cavendish, and in the lower portion by Mr. Pike, and by Edith. This arrangement had a name in houses like Ashbourne Park. It was called order, and it was maintained so that people like Halloway did not have to think about people like Edith. Edith had not resented it. She had expected it. She had been at Ashbourne Park for 6 months, and she had done her work, and she had done it well, and she had been, to the household and to the family it served, the cook. Not invisible, precisely. More like furniture. Present and functional and not required to be anything else. That had been before the evening of the dinner, before the copper ladle and the salt and the metallic bitterness, and Halloway coming below stairs in his evening dress and looking at her as though she were a specific person. Edith did not know, then, what to do with that. She did not think she would be required to do anything with it at all. She was, to the Dowager Viscountess Dorothea, just the cook. And the Dowager Viscountess Dorothea was the kind of woman who decided what things were, and was very rarely wrong about it. She learned this, the morning after the dinner. When she overheard Dorothea in the passage outside the kitchen door, speaking to Miss Garnett in a low and certain voice. "She is competent," Dorothea said. "I grant her that. She is, at the end of it, just the cook. We will thank her appropriately. Richard has always been too soft-hearted about the staff." Miss Garnett said something Edith did not catch. "He will recover his perspective," Dorothea said. "He always does." Edith went back to the stove. She stirred the morning porridge. She did not feel the need to recover her perspective, because her perspective had never been displaced. She was just the cook. She had always known she was just the cook. The evening before had been, she told herself, an anomaly. A consequence of crisis. The Viscount Halloway had come below stairs because there was an emergency, and he was a man who managed his emergencies directly. He would not come below again. He came below again the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard his step on the stone path, which was a particular sound because he walked with a particular deliberateness, as though each step were a decision. She had her hands on the kitchen garden wall, which was cold September stone, steadying herself because the morning was still affecting her more than she wanted to admit. Her jaw ached faintly. She was trying to decide whether thyme or rosemary for the evening's lamb. Halloway stopped a few feet from her. He stood with his hands behind his back, which was his standing posture when he was not moving, and he looked at the garden. "The physician said the tasting was the cause of your indisposition this morning," he said, without turning to look at her. "It is already less than yesterday," Edith said. "Mr. Pike has traced the salt to a supplier in Bristol. The cask was contaminated with arsenical compounds from the warehouse where it was stored. The supplier will not be used again." "That is a relief," Edith said. She meant it absolutely, without drama. Halloway was quiet for a moment. A bird moved through the bare hedge at the garden's edge. He said, "Why did you taste it yourself, rather than send word upstairs?" It was not the question she had expected. She had expected questions about the stew, about the service, about the salt. She said, honestly, "Because if I had been wrong about the smell of it, I did not want to cause alarm over nothing. And if I was right, I needed to know immediately. Not after someone had gone up and come back down." He turned, then, and looked at her for the second time with that particular quality of looking, the kind that had no function except attention. "My wife died of a fever," he said. 3 years ago. It passed through the tenant cottages in June, and I was in London. She had gone to the cottages to see to the families, and she was not the sort of woman who could be persuaded not to. I came home when she was already past the point of the physician being useful. Edith did not speak. She knew instinctively that he did not need her to speak. "I have thought many times since then," he said, "about the specific hour on the third day when I could have come home if I had left London when the news arrived, rather than finishing what I was doing." He stopped. He looked at the kitchen garden wall where her hands rested, and his expression was not readable as grief, precisely, but as something that had been grief for so long it had become the shape of his face. "You tasted it," he said, "before you were certain it was dangerous. You accepted the risk of being wrong in order to prevent a harm that had not yet occurred." "I was not thinking about it in those terms," Edith said. "I know," he said. "That is why it matters." He stood there for a moment longer, in the kitchen garden in the September morning, and Edith held the cold stone under her hands and did not know where to look. Then he said, "Come inside," with the instruction so automatic she thought he might not have been aware of it. "It is cold. You have been unwell." She went inside. Not because he told her to. Because the kitchen was warm and her hands were cold. and she had porridge on. But she thought about the way he had said it, plainly, as though her coming inside were simply a fact that needed to occur. And she thought about the kitchen garden with the cold stone wall and the morning light, and she did not tell herself anything definitive about any of it. She was the cook. This was true. She had also, for a moment in the kitchen garden, felt very specifically seen, in a way she had not felt in 17 months, and she did not know what to do with that except to carry it carefully, the way she carried the copper ladle, as something that was hers from before, something she had not expected to find here. If the days following the dinner had a quality, it was a quality of altered attention. Halloway had always been precise and efficient in his running of the household, but his attention, which had always moved in straight lines above stairs, began to take small, careful detours. He stopped in the passage outside the kitchen on 2 occasions when Edith heard his step slow. He did not come in, yet the step slowed. On the 3rd morning after the dinner, he sent Gideon to the kitchen with a message asking whether the preserved lemons in the pantry were the sort Edith preferred for the lamb, or whether she required a different kind, which was the sort of question a viscount does not send messages about. Mr. Pike looked at the message. Edith looked at the message. She sent back a reply that the lemons were satisfactory. Thank you, which was true, and which was all she allowed herself. Nance watched all of this with the avid attention of a 17-year-old to whom something is obviously happening. He has never asked about the lemons before, Nance said. He has not asked before because it was not relevant before, Edith said. He was thorough about the salt. He is being thorough about the kitchen. That is all. Nance looked at her in a way that suggested she did not believe this explanation. Edith did not entirely believe it herself. She believed it less after the afternoon when Clara came below with her hair partially loose from its ribbon and her pinafore showing signs of a recent encounter with the mud beside the garden gate, and Edith sat her on the stool and repinned the ribbon and did not say anything about the pinafore, and Halloway came to the kitchen door and stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sitting placidly on the stool while Edith redressed her hair, and his face did something that Edith did not look directly at, because it was the kind of moment that does not hold if you name it. He said, "Clara." Just the name. And Clara looked up and said, "Miss Morrow's fingers are gentler than Simmons's," with absolute certainty. And Halloway said, "I am aware she has her qualities," which was not quite looking at Edith, and not quite not. Dorothea arrived for her weekly visit to the household on the following Thursday. Dorothea Cavendish lived at the Dower House on the west edge of the estate, which was a 20-minute walk from the main house and which she treated as a disadvantage to be compensated for by increased managerial attention. She came on Thursdays to review the household accounts with Mr. Pike, to inspect the public rooms, and to take tea with Halloway in the drawing room, which faced south and had the good light and the portrait of the late Viscountess above the mantel. She had arranged for the dinner the previous week to have Miss Garnett brought from Bath by the Garnett family's carriage, and she intended to arrange it again now that the unfortunate incident with the stew was done with. Edith was not present for Dorothea's Thursday visits. Edith was in the kitchen, where she was supposed to be. She was aware of Dorothea's Thursday visits in the way that the kitchen is always aware of what occurs above it, through the pattern of footsteps and the frequency of orders, and the face of the footman who carries the tea tray back. On this particular Thursday, the face of the footman suggested that the tea had been consumed with unusual speed and that the atmosphere above stairs had been concentrated. Miss Garnett came on the Saturday. This Edith knew, because Nance told her. In the breathless way, Nance relayed all information she considered significant. Miss Garnett came in a carriage with 2 trunks and a lady's maid, which suggested she expected to stay for more than a week. She was, by Nance's account, extremely pretty in an insistent way. with the kind of fair complexion that made the drawing room portraits by which she was surrounded look like rehearsals for her eventual arrival. She was 22 and had had the previous London season and had apparently been considered a reasonable possibility for 3 different gentlemen of standing, none of whom had materialized into anything conclusive, which was why Dorothea had brought her to Ashbourne Park. Edith heard all of this. She sent up an excellent dinner. She watched the orders that came back from the dining room. Miss Garnett's preferences: no parsley, light cream sauces only. A dislike of anything that could be described as rustic. She accommodated them without comment. She was the cook. The dining room had guests. It was all quite orderly, and she was fine. She was less fine on the Sunday afternoon when she was moving through the passage to collect something from the still room, and heard through the half-open door to the morning room Dorothea speaking to someone. "You cannot allow sentiment to guide you, Richard," Dorothea said. "I understand the cook prevented a disaster. I have acknowledged it. I shall see that she is thanked. What you are doing now, going below stairs at odd hours, asking about lemons, allowing Clara to treat the kitchen as her private nursery, it does not reflect well. Miss Garnett is not stupid. She notices." Halloway said something Edith could not hear. "It is misplaced gratitude," Dorothea said. "That is all it is. A sensible woman would have done the same. She is just the cook, Richard. She will be thanked. And she will go on being an excellent cook. And that will be the end of it. Miss Garnett has a great deal to recommend her. You know what the family needs." Edith moved past the door. She went to the still room. She collected the dried mint she had come for. She went back to the kitchen. She was just the cook. Dorothea was right about that. Dorothea was, in general, right about the order of things, because the order of things had been arranged specifically to make Dorothea right. Edith knew this. She had known it since February 2 years ago, when the solicitor had explained the debts and the world had reorganized itself around what she was and was not. She was not, and had never been, the kind of woman for whom a viscount's careful detour meant anything permanent. She was not the kind of woman who sat across from him in the drawing room. She was not the kind of woman who warranted the south drawing room's good light. She was the kind of woman who managed the kitchen and made thin pastry and repinned the hair of children and was thanked appropriately and went on. She set the copper ladle on the block. She worked with her hands, because her hands were her steadiest part. She worked until the dinner was done and sent up, and then she sat for a moment in the kitchen alone, and she was practical and clear-eyed about all of it, because she had had 2 years of practice at being practical and clear-eyed. The following morning she woke before light, and knew, with a quiet finality that had no specific source, that she would leave Ashbourne Park. She told herself it was the sensible course. She told herself the position had become complicated by circumstances no one had intended. She told herself she could find another kitchen. She had found this one. She had found this one by noticing her own constitution and acting from it. And her constitution still held. And she would find something. She did not tell herself that the copper ladle would hang on a different hook in a different kitchen, and that this was fine, because some things you do not tell yourself. You simply pack your box. She had the box half full when Clara came to the kitchen at 6 in the morning, which was earlier than Clara was supposed to be below stairs, and which Clara had apparently decided was a detail she was comfortable overlooking. She came in her morning dress with her hair already pinned, because she was 7 and precise, and she looked at the box. "Where are you going?" Clara said. "I have been offered another position," Edith said. This was not entirely untrue. She had several letters she had not yet answered. "I do not want you to go," Clara said. "I know," Edith said. "I am sorry." Clara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the box and at Edith, and at the copper ladle on the block. Then she left. Edith heard her small, certain footsteps going back up the service stairs. She folded another apron. She looked at the copper ladle. She was thinking about whether to pack it or to wrap it separately when she heard steps above her, not Clara's, and then the door at the top of the service stairs opened for the second time in as many weeks. Holloway came down quickly, without the deliberateness of his usual step. He was not in morning dress. His coat was not fully on, and his cravat was tied with evident haste rather than precision. He stopped when he saw the box. He looked at the box. He looked at her. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was suppressing something at speed. "Clara told me," he said. "I have been offered another position," Edith said. "You have not." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet in the way kitchens are at 6 in the morning before the fire has been properly built up, and the light through the high window was the particular thin gray of early autumn, and it found the lines of his face and the silver at his temples, and made him look very much like what he was, which was a man who was about to say something he had decided to say, and was going to say it regardless of what preceded it. "My mother spoke to you," he said. "Your mother did not speak to me. I overheard." "What did you hear?" Edith put the apron down. She said evenly, "That I am just the cook, that I will be thanked and go on, that Miss Garnett has a great deal to recommend her, and the family has its needs." She paused, none of which is incorrect. Something moved in Holloway's face. He crossed the kitchen. He did not do it in 5 strides this time. He did it in 3, which was faster than she had seen him move, which meant something, though she could not account for what. He stopped very close to her, close enough that she could see the uneven tie of his cravat and the line of his jaw, and the fact that he had not slept well, which was a thing she had begun to recognize in him. The particular shadow under his eyes that meant a night spent somewhere other than rest. "You are not just the cook," he said. "Your mother believes I am," Edith said. "My mother believes a great many things about the order of this household," he said. "She believed my wife was the correct choice for me. She was not wrong about that. She believed the salt from Bristol was from a reliable supplier. She was wrong about that. She believes Miss Garnett is the correct choice now." His voice was level, the way water is level when it is very deep. "She does not see you." "No one at Ashbourne Park sees me," Edith said. "That is appropriate. I am the cook." "I see you," Holloway said. He said it with a quietness that did not permit argument. Edith had observed across 6 months, and a crisis, and a kitchen garden, and a conversation about lemons, a particular capacity for saying simple sentences with the weight of things that had taken a long time to become true. "You see a woman who happened to prevent a domestic disaster," Edith said. "I see a woman who tasted something before she was afraid of it," he said. "I see a woman who repins my daughter's hair and does not tell her to go away. I see a woman who brought her own ladle to a house she could not have been certain would hold her, because it was hers, and she did not intend to give everything up." He stopped. "You are not leaving this house." "You cannot simply," she said. "Come with me," he said. "Now, into the drawing room." "I am not dressed to be in the drawing room," Edith said. "I am not dressed for the drawing room either," Holloway said, and he looked down briefly at his coat, which had one lapel half folded, and something crossed his face that was very nearly rueful. "Come anyway. If you have stayed with Edith Morrow this far, if you have stayed through the kitchen and the cold stone and the copper ladle and the 6 months of being furniture in a house that did not see her, then you already know what it cost her to walk up those service stairs. To cross the passage in her kitchen dress and her working apron with the copper ladle's handle marks still on her palm. To follow Halloway through the green baize door and into the hall that smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers and the particular quality of air that belongs to rooms where people of consequence live their morning lives. If something here moves you, if Edith's particular kind of steadiness is the thing you come to these stories to find, leave a word in the comments. She did not know, walking up those stairs, whether she was walking toward something or away from everything. The kitchen door was behind her. The drawing room was ahead. She went. The drawing room faced south. Dorothea Cavendish was already there, which was a fact Halloway had apparently been aware of, because he had brought Edith there despite knowing it. Miss Garnett sat beside Dorothea on the silk settee, in a morning dress the color of the sky in good weather, her hands folded in her lap with the discipline of a woman who has been educated about the placement of her hands. Mr. Pike stood near the window with an expression of a man who has been summoned to a meeting he did not request. Dorothea looked at Edith in the doorway, and then at Halloway, and then back at Edith, and her expression was very still in the way of faces that have not finished calculating. "Richard," she said. "The matter of Miss Morrow's position," Halloway said. He had moved to stand beside Edith, not in front of her, not behind her, but level with her, which was a thing she noticed because she noticed everything. "I want it resolved." "Her position is in the kitchen," Dorothea said. "It is perfectly clear." "Her position was in the kitchen," Halloway said. "That is no longer sufficient." "Richard, this is not the moment," Dorothea said. "It is precisely the moment." He looked at his mother, and then at Miss Garnett, who was looking at Edith with an expression that Edith could not quite read, except to say that it was not unkind. He said, "I am aware of what the family requires. I am aware of what is considered correct. I am aware that you have brought Miss Garnett here with a specific intention, and I appreciate the thought behind it. And I am going to ask you to bring her home." Dorothea sat very still. Her fan, which was in her hand but not open, went through one small compression. "She is just the cook," Dorothea said. "Richard, whatever gratitude you feel." "She is mine," Halloway said. 12 words, or fewer. He said, "Miss Morrow does not leave this house. She is mine." He said it in the drawing room where the portrait of the late Viscountess hung above the mantel, in the drawing room where the south light came in and found Edith in her kitchen apron beside the man who had just said her name as though it were a thing he had decided, and Dorothea's hand stilled entirely on the fan, and Mr. Pike looked at the window. Miss Garnett, whose expression had been unreadable, looked at Edith with something that might, in another light, have been recognition. She stood after a moment, smoothly and without drama, and said to Dorothea quietly that perhaps they might take some air, and this was the kindest thing anyone with a great deal to recommend her had done in this drawing room in some time. Dorothea stood. She looked at Halloway one more time. The kind of look that is a whole argument held in a single bearing. And then she looked at Edith. And what she saw in Edith's face must have been informative, because her own face did something small and complicated, something that was not yet surrender, but was the nearest approach to it that a woman of her character makes before she goes to take air and reconsiders her position in the garden. She left. Miss Garnett followed. Mr. Pike said something quietly to Halloway about the Bristol supplier, who had been notified and whose account had been settled and closed, and that the new arrangements for the salt were in order. He said it in the tone of a man who has always known which things in a household require practical resolution, and which things resolve themselves. Then he too left, and Edith and Halloway were alone in the south drawing room with the portrait above the mantel, and the morning light, and the sound of the fire. Edith looked at the portrait. She had never been in this room before. The late Viscountess had been a fine-looking woman with the kind of face that holds its attention even in oil, with a particular warmth in the expression that suggested she had been someone her household had loved. She was wearing blue. She had the set of the jaw that Clara had. "You did not have to do that in front of everyone," Edith said. "You were packing," Holloway said. "That does not require an audience." "My mother required an audience," he said, "so that there is no question about what I have said." Edith looked at him. He was watching her with the directness he used when he had decided something, which was the directness that did not apologize for itself. His cravat was still uneven. The lapel was still half-folded. He had come from her kitchen on his way to this room without stopping to be fully dressed, and this struck her as the most definitive thing about him she had yet observed. "You said I am yours," she said. "You should perhaps explain what you mean by that." "I should perhaps explain," he said, "that I am not in the practice of explaining myself. I will make an effort, for you, because you are precise, and because you tasted something before you were afraid of it, and I've been trying to learn that particular quality for 3 years, without much progress." The light was on his face now. It was a good light, and it found him honestly. "I mean," he said, "that I have been watching you since the morning after the dinner, and what I have observed is a woman who does not diminish herself for the convenience of a room, and who does not perform her dignity for an audience, and who repins my daughter's hair because it wants pinning, and who brought her own ladle to a house that should have been beneath her, and has made it excellent." He paused. "I mean that I do not want you in my kitchen, Edith. I want you in the rest of my house." Edith stood in the south drawing room and said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about her father's kitchen at Hutton Mallow, and the copper ladle that hung there, and the morning she had taken it down from its hook and wrapped it in a cloth, and put it in her box because it was hers. She was thinking about the solicitor, and the debts, and the spare room in Bath, and the advertisement in the Chronicle. She was thinking about 6 months of being the cook, of being furniture, of being just the function of the house. And she was thinking about the kitchen garden and the cold stone, and the particular way this man's voice had said her name in this drawing room just now, as though it were a thing he had decided rather than something he had been instructed to feel. She was also thinking about Clara. The hair and the pinafore, and the thin pastry with more butter, and the question about the ladle, and the small person who had stood in the kitchen door that morning and said, "I do not want you to go," with the absolute certainty of someone who has not learned yet that what you want is frequently beside the point. "I am the cook," Edith said. "You are," he said. "You are also the woman I am asking to stay." He did not dress it up. He did not make a speech of it. He looked at her across the morning room with the particular directness of a man who has been calculating something for weeks, and has arrived at his conclusion and is now presenting it plainly, as a fact that needs only to be accepted. "Your mother will need time," Edith said. "My mother will need considerably more than time," Holloway said. "My mother is going to require the better part of a season, and possibly an entirely new hat. I am prepared to fund the hat." It was not quite humor. It was very nearly humor. It was the closest Edith had seen him come to it, and it arrived so unexpectedly that she felt it before she could prevent herself, a warmth somewhere in the vicinity of her chest that was not from the fire. "Your cravat is uneven," she said. He looked down. He looked back up. "Yes," he said. "You came below stairs before finishing dressing," she said. "You were packing," he said again. And that was, she thought, the end of the argument. The December that followed was cold at Ashbourne Park in the way that Wiltshire can be cold, with a particular quality of grey sky and frost on the kitchen garden wall, and snow that began in the night and was still going at breakfast, soft and unhurried. The Dower House had received, in the intervening weeks, several long letters from Halloway, and 2 visits that Edith was not privy to, and one afternoon in which Dorothea came to take tea in the drawing-room and looked at Edith. When Edith brought the tray, with the expression of a woman who has recalculated and is not pleased with the arithmetic, but is nonetheless prepared to proceed. She did not say anything. She looked at the tray, and she looked at Edith, and she said, "The ginger biscuits." And Edith said, "Yes." And that was the nearest thing to a peace that 2 people of their constitutions were going to manage, and they both understood it as such, which was perhaps the beginning of something. Miss Garnett had gone back to Bath. She had gone, according to Nance's report, without apparent distress, which suggested she had possessed more information about her own feelings on the subject than her position at the dinner table had implied. Edith thought, occasionally, about the unreadable expression on Miss Garnett's face in the drawing-room, the one that might have been recognition, and she hoped the woman found somewhere she was not just the right choice, but the chosen one. Halloway had not said anything else dramatic. He did not, in general, say dramatic things. He came to the kitchen garden in the mornings when the weather permitted, and stood where he had stood that first morning, and watched Edith work. And sometimes he spoke about the estate, or about Clara, or about the salt supplier in Bristol, whose place had been taken by a far more reliable man in Marlborough, and sometimes he did not speak. And both things were equally comfortable, which Edith knew meant something definitive, even before she was prepared to call it by its name. On the Thursday before Christmas, Clara appeared in the kitchen with a small bunch of winter greenery from the garden, holly and a few sprigs of dried lavender she had cut herself, and presented them to Edith with the ceremony of someone making an official transaction. Edith took them and put them in the blue jug on the windowsill, the one that had stood empty since October. "They are from the garden," Clara said. "They are very fine," Edith said. "Thank you." "Papa said you like lavender," Clara said. "Above the window." She looked at the copper ladle on the block. "Will it stay now?" Edith looked at the ladle. It had hung, the previous morning, not on the block, but on a hook beside the kitchen hearth, a hook that had not been there the week before and that Mr. Pike had not installed. She had not asked about the hook. She had simply hung the ladle on it and stood back and looked at it there, her father's copper ladle above a fire that was hers now, and she had felt the particular warmth of something that has found the place it was always going to end up. "It will stay," Edith said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and climbed onto the stool. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was still falling. Not urgently. Not in the way of winter threatening the roads, or icing the kitchen garden, or making the estate grounds treacherous. Just falling, the way snow falls when it is not trying to do anything except be what it is, soft and steady over the stone walls and the bare hedges and the frosted kitchen garden and the hooks beside the kitchen hearth, covering everything that had been cold and leaving it, for now, white and still and untroubled. The fire crackled. The copper ladle hung above it, bright in the firelight. Her father's ladle in her own kitchen. The same object it had always been, doing what it had always done. Only here. Finally. In the place where it was staying. Edith smoothed her apron and lifted the ladle from its hook. She rested it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it on the block, because there was dinner to begin. And she was the cook. And this was her house now. And the family was hungry. Thank you for staying with Edith until the end. If her steadiness found you somewhere, leave a word below. There are more stories where this one came from.